This week, we are continuing our series PRISM, and this is where we talk to scholars and leaders from other religions and faith systems. This week, we're going to feature my interview with Duane Bidwell, and he's the professor of practical theology, spiritual care, and counseling at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University. He is the author of 3 books and the editor of 2, but for our purposes, the book that we're most interested in exploring in this context is When One Religion Isn't Enough, The Lives of Spiritually Fluid People. So I first came across Duane as a guest speaker in one of my classes at Claremont School of Theology, where he was talking about his experience incorporating Buddhism and Christianity and other meditative and contemplative practices. And this was fascinating to me because coming from a more evangelical, fundamentalist tinged background of Christianity, there was always that emphasis on anything that didn't fit the mold being potentially dangerous or even evil. So being around people who are living out their faith in vibrant and incredible ways has really been impacting for me, and I've seen it as impacting being in a community of leaders who are more receptive to a variety of faiths. Also, from a personal perspective, having had Duane as my professor in my last semester of seminary, as we were dealing with COVID-19 as a community and faith leaders and a country and a world, to have a professor who was so in tune with where we were at as far as our own anxiety, the demands on us as pastors and leaders and colleagues, and the grace that he extended and exhibited in caring for us beyond his concern for what we were turning in was transformational for so many of us, and a reminder that as we navigate life as believers, as Christians, or however we identify as spiritual people, that we're doing this for those around us. So I hope you really enjoy this interview. It was pretty amazing for me to have the opportunity to do. What was your early religious experience like? What was your perception of God? And did that feel nurturing or oppressive or inspiring? And, like from childhood to young adult?
Well, I grew up virtually unchurched. My nuclear family, or my family of origin, went to church maybe on Easter and maybe on Christmas. We stopped going after I was 11 years old and argued with the pastor on the way out of Easter worship. My parents didn't think that was appropriate, so we just stopped going. But when I did go to church as a child, I went with my maternal grandparents, who were Methodists. It was an odd experience because I never confused God and church as a kid. But my grandmother would sit me on one side of her, my brother on the other side, and she would hold a little flap of skin between her fingers. And if we acted up, she would pinch a little bit harder to make us behave. So church was never a pleasant place. And I often heard my mother talk about feeling guilty that we weren't going to church, or that we weren't being raised in a way that was familiar with Christianity, or more intimately familiar. And so I always associated religion or church life with oughts. You ought to do this. You ought to do that. You need to behave. It was always very strange to me why we ought to do those things. Like, I didn't have a context for understanding where that was coming from for my mother. I mostly experienced the holy out in the forest. I grew up on 13 acres, wooded, trees, forest, fields, gravel pit, drainage ditch, stream. And so when I experienced the holy, I experienced it there. And more of a sense of mystery, and benevolent presence. But no one, as a child, no one helped me understand that those were spiritual experiences. And so I didn't connect the God I heard about in church or at vacation Bible school with what I was experiencing out in nature. I only knew that I felt in touch with something and comforted when I was out in the woods or riding my bike way out on the prairie. I grew up in Illinois, so endless cornfields and soybeans and so on and so forth.
So you said that you didn't connect the two experiences, but did you feel a need for God, or did you realize out in nature that you were connecting with God?
I knew I was connecting to something, but I didn't call it God necessarily. It was more like the spirit of the woods, or this presence, or this kind of mystical world. I read a lot of young adult fiction, fantasy stuff when I was a kid, and it's in some ways got conflated with that. It wasn't until high school, when I started dating a Methodist minister's daughter, that I began to connect that with what they talked about at church, and to experience a different sort of Christianity, and a family that was grounded very much in their faith, and for whom church was at the center of everything: social life, religious life, spiritual life, those kinds of things. So then I began to say, this thing that they're talking about is like what I experience when I'm out in nature. And I was always curious about contemplative practices and contemplative traditions, so meditation and that kind of thing. And as I got older in high school, I started to sit with the Quakers, because in that community, and in the silence, and in the emphasis on the inner light, I found a little bit of what I was looking for. Of course, there was no formal instruction in meditation or scripture or spiritual practices or those kinds of things. So it was still a little bit odd, but it was a place where I found that need for silence and contemplative awareness developed and nurtured, and not treated as something odd. My family thought that was very odd, but at the Quakers, it was the norm. So it was a place to fit in some ways.
I love the direction that this is going, because one of my early experiences connecting to the spiritual really was in magical spaces. And for me, it was being out in the forest and looking for fairies, or, kind of interest in the supernatural.
Right.
And then realizing as you get older and get more entrenched in Christianity that there's not a lot of acceptance, in my experience, that not only was there not a lot of acceptance for that, but that it was looked at as, at least marginally apostate and maybe really evil. So I'm wondering what your experience was, that if you were second guessing yourself at the point at which you were kind of connecting with your Christianity and incorporating spiritual practice, because that also, I think that we get this message that meditation or engaging any type of more contemplative prayer or contemplative practice really opens us up. And I'm talking about from the perspective of kind of Western evangelicalism, that can be spiritually dangerous.
Yeah, no, I didn't encounter that until I was in college. And it's interesting you talk about those things being looked down on. I think it depends on the type of Christianity you encounter, right? So no one ever pathologized that experience for me, or told me it was dangerous, or dismissed it as not real. And there are expressions of Christianity around the world where attunement to the land, attunement to local spirits, attunement to indigenous traditions is still a part of Christianity. I think of the early Celtic Christian tradition, where that was very much the case. So you and I grew up in a mainline Protestant tradition that was kind of split off from those kinds of things. But I think through books and reading, I grew up in a university town with lots of used bookstores and lots of children's authors and others. I connected to some of those things without realizing it was a part of Christianity. It wasn't until I went to college in Texas and encountered Texas Southern Baptist Convention and a more evangelical Christianity that I began to hear that I was endangering myself, or that everyone except Christians were going to hell, and those kinds of things. The city where I grew up was very cosmopolitan for a town on the prairie, and from my earliest childhood school experiences, I had friends who were Hindu and Jewish and Catholic and Christian and Baha'i, and from all different races and ethnicities. So that kind of more narrow interpretation of Christianity wasn't prevalent where I was at the time, but I certainly encountered it when I left my bubble of university town and went into the world of Texas social conservatism, religious conservatism, political conservatism.
This is one of the reasons it felt so important to discuss this with you, because my early experience was similar to yours. I mean, I say that I was raised by educated hippies. So it was very, having the access to academia and different faith systems and not feeling any pushback in my family for whatever I believed or I was interested in. But my early, connection to Christianity was with that more conservative sect. And I'm seeing, and I want to sidetrack for a moment and say how surprising it was to me. And this was at CST, like in the last few years, connecting with someone who said, yeah, growing up for me in church, there was never talk of spiritual warfare or being scared of the devil or, an eternity in hell. There was no fire and brimstone doctrine. And I think it's so important that we let people know, because in my own church, while we're very open and affirming and doing this series where we're interviewing scholars and leaders from different faith traditions, so many of us come from these backgrounds that felt extremely oppressive, and where a lot of us connected with the God of our understanding, but it came with a whole lot of baggage. So I was listening recently to a friend of mine who's a pastor, and I love his teaching, and we diverged theologically on some stuff. And he was talking about the upcoming National Day of Prayer, and talking about how, local churches, he was named off some local churches, and he said, and we're going to get together and pray because we're all in this together. And he was talking about doing this virtually. And I was like, yeah, we're not there. My church is, again, it's open and affirming. We have a large LGBTQ population. And I wonder, how do we know being in community that this pushes people away. So I want to get to how you ended up incorporating Buddhism to your own faith tradition. But can we also do church better in a way that we are not pushing people away? And what does that look like?
That's a huge question.
I know.
And there are about 4 different questions embedded in
Hey,
it. So
go for it.
Narrow it down to one to start.
Yes. How do we do church better? Can we do church better in a way that shows the love and redemption that we find in Jesus without forcing people out?
Here's what I know about congregations. No matter what the embedded theologies are in the congregation, and even if the pastor is more conserving and condemning, the congregation itself takes care of its own. There's an awful lot of community, an awful lot of compassion embedded in that. That doesn't mean that the theology is good, the articulated theology, but the behavioral theology communicates a very different message than what the official doctrine or the preaching and teaching of the congregation might be communicating. And, one of my first ministry positions was in HIV/AIDS work in Texas. And working with faith communities to provide volunteer caregivers to take care of people who were dying. This was in the days before AZT and other antiretrovirals. Take care of people who were at home dying, and often welcoming into the congregation children of the church or the synagogue who had rejected the church, but were coming home to die with their parents, and the ways in which the practice of the congregation and the articulated theology began to shift because of these mothers and fathers who were caring for dying daughters and sons. And their friends needed to support them. And so the shifts that happen as people care for each other, don't always have, the congregation doesn't always have language to talk about what they're experiencing. The only language they have is that old embedded language. So doing church better, I'm not sure what that looks like in terms of the outside world, but within our doors, I think it has to do with helping people find their own language for what they're experiencing of God, and not limiting their options to a very thin story, a very thin account of what it means to be Christian, or what God is and isn't, or what God expects and doesn't expect, but to talk about how they experience God in their own words, to hear them into voice about their own experiences. And one of the parallels that I have found in talking in congregations about the book, when it came to HIV/AIDS, it was little old church ladies, and I don't want to use that, it's not pejorative, right? The backbone of the church. They're the ones who began to shift the local theology that trickled up into denominations, right? The movement we've seen about marriage equality in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, I think started with all of these gay men coming home to small little churches and the community having to care for them, and ideas and theology shifted. Not everyone who had HIV in those days was gay and so on and so forth, but it had an effect, and those were the associations. And it's similar when I talk about religious multiplicity. I go to congregations to talk about the idea of having or claiming complex religious bonds, of bringing Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism together with Christianity. It is the little old church ladies who say, I don't have a problem with that. That fits with how I experience God. I refuse to believe that God is going to condemn my half-Jewish grandchildren. I refuse to believe that God has rejected my daughter who rejected the church, right? Those women, and some men, but mostly women, are already on board with these changes because they're experiencing God as present with them in these mixed faith families, in people who are living out their spirituality differently. So I don't know that we can do church better to pull in the people who've been wounded by that kind of talk, right? The challenge is to change the way we talk on the outside. There's a May Sarton. May Sarton is a poet and novelist and memoir writer. And one of my favorite lines from one of her poems is, we convert if we do it all, not by asking the impossible, but by being something irresistible. That converting is about modeling. Evangelizing is about modeling for people the difference that our faith has made in our lives, and making that irresistible. Not in terms of saying, here's what God expects of you, but saying, here's how my life has changed. I have something you want. Yeah. So I've wandered far afield from your questions, but I'll pause there.
No, you actually didn't. And it makes me realize that the question shouldn't be, how do we do church better, but how do we be the church better? And what you've described is exactly what we see in Scripture. We see this variety of experiences and individuals who none of them fit any mold, and still they're being used in this process to bring redemption and bring hope and build relationship. So as we're talking about individual experience, I'm really interested in what spirituality and community looks like for you now. And if you could expound on specifically what your faith looks like, what types of faith you incorporate, what different religious traditions you incorporate, and what your religious community looks like now.
So I'm a Presbyterian Church USA pastor, and PCUSA pastors don't belong to congregations. Our membership is in a broader regional body. We're expected to be connected to a local congregation. So my membership is in Eastern Oklahoma Presbyterian, which is the last place I served before coming to California. But my family, my wife is a deacon and an elder, both at Claremont Presbyterian Church. My child was confirmed there and is a member. And I participate in the life of that congregation. Sometimes corporate worship. I lead a weekly contemplative prayer group on Thursday mornings. We sit in silence together and then we go out for coffee and we have conversation. I volunteer, I teach, I do that kind of leadership. I offer pastoral support to some of the staff who, as you know, it's hard for pastors to have a pastor. And so I have often intentionally assumed that role in the communities where I've lived and worked, because pastors need somebody they can talk to who's not engaged in the politics of the congregation. I practice Vipassana meditation, which is a form of early Buddhist meditation, insight meditation. And I occasionally chant Buddhist chants and texts.
Can you describe that meditation and what chanting is and what that process looks like? Because I think for a lot of the people listening, we hear those things, but we don't understand the practice or the experience.
Sure. So insight meditation is a process of sitting quietly and attending to the breath in order, early stages, to develop a certain level of concentration so that you can begin to then move into more advanced stages, still early, but more advanced, to have insight into the nature of reality, into the way things really are. And in Vipassana, you start out building that capacity. And then when you actually turn to the practice of Vipassana itself, you're meditating on the body, you're meditating on sensations, you're meditating on emotions, feelings, you're meditating on consciousness as you move up through stages. And so it's a practice of being very still and letting go of thoughts and paying attention to the impermanence of the self and the emptiness of the self and the way in which, when we want something to be different, I see that, I want it, or I don't like this, get it away from me, or oh, this is okay, I can just live with this, it's fine. Those forms of clinging create suffering for us. So Vipassana is helping you break your attachments in some ways to that idea of I need or I don't want, to have a clearer understanding of the interdependent nature of reality. And that gets very esoteric very quickly, right? The chanting is a part of a process of honoring the teacher, honoring the community, honoring the teachings, and using that to center yourself and to assume the posture of meditation that helps with meditation and that kind of thing. You know, my altar, which you can't see behind me, has Jesus and the Buddha. It has some Tibetan deities that were blessed by a Tibetan Lama who gave them to me particularly. It has, well, you can see the icon over my shoulder is usually on the altar, which is a Syrian Christ, Syriac Christ, Christ of the desert. And I sometimes chant Christian prayer to the rhythm of Buddhist chants, or use Buddhist norms for chanting sacred text with Christian text. So instead of taking refuge in the Buddha and the teaching and the Buddhist community, I might chant Glory to the incarnate one, the crucified one, the resurrected one. So I'm using the form of a Buddhist chant, which is not that different from some Eastern Orthodox Christian chants, to articulate Christian prayer, because chanting is important to me. I might read the Philippians hymn, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, to the rhythm of a Buddhist sutra. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, to create that contemplative space for myself. Right? So in some ways, it is taking the forms of one tradition and the content of another, but it is also about allowing the two traditions to serve as glasses, right? And I have a Buddhist lens and a Christian lens, and I can put those on and I can look. Some places they overlap and they bring things into focus. Some places the prescription is really different and you can't see clearly.
Yeah. So how did you find Buddhism? And did you feel conflicted as you started to go in the direction of incorporating the meditation and the chanting, or did it just feel like the natural progression? Because I have to say, what you described, especially in the, I don't remember the phrase that you used, but kind of divesting ourselves of materialism or strongholds or whatever, that's Jesus. I mean,
yeah,
that's the call.
So the question was, how did I come to Buddhism?
Yeah. And did you feel any conflict as you?
Yeah, I was always curious about meditation as a child, as I said, but there was no one around who taught me about meditation. It wasn't a part of my family's know all be all. And I wasn't, I was a townie. I grew up in a blue collar family in a university town. So we didn't have access to the privilege and resources of the university community. We were sort of on the fringe in some ways. So I didn't access those resources a lot. I always was drawn to Buddhism and wanted to learn more about it, and would try reading books, and that didn't help, right? In college, I was required to take a religion course. And for almost everybody, that means you take Intro to World Religions or you take Baby Bible. And I refused to take the intro courses because I wanted to take Buddhism. But Buddhism was only available to upper class students. And so I waited until my senior year to take Buddhism. And I was also working as a journalist and taking the course on Buddhism. I started to write a story about a Thai missionary Buddhist temple. Thai monks who had come to the States to be religious and spiritual leaders for the Laotian Lao community who fled the communist takeover of Lao and settled in a very traditional village in North Texas. So a Lao village and a Thai village both would have the temple at the center and the houses around it. And they actually bought a big piece of land and built a temple in the middle and had houses around it. And the monks went begging for alms every morning and that kind of thing. And I became friends with one of the monks. So I was learning about Buddhism as a discipline from a religious studies perspective, but I was also imbibing Buddhism as a lived community. And Tui Mahaviro, invited me to go to Thailand with him. He needed to renew his visa, but also for a ceremony to make merit for his father. And I went to Thailand then for 8 weeks with Tui and lived at the temples in Bangkok and in Hoi An province, far northeast Thailand on the border of Laos. And came home convinced that I wanted to learn more with a teacher, and found a Vietnamese monk who had a temple nearby and began to study with him. And I never felt conflicted because I didn't necessarily identify as Christian at the time. I took vows as a lay Buddhist, and I eventually became I was given permission to teach certain forms of meditation. I would give the English translation of sermons on holidays and that kind of thing. Not my own words, but the translation of what the master said. for many years, I was the spiritual director for a Catholic woman who had 7 children and who herself was a spiritual director for a number of priests and avowed religious. And she would say, God knew you were never coming to church unless you learned to do contemplative prayer. And that's why God led you to the Buddhist temple. Be careful when you start praying. Strange things happen. So I don't want to say that Vipassana meditation and Buddhist meditation are contemplative prayer in the Christian sense, but that process of training my body, soul, and minds, my body, spirit, and minds, opened me up to new experiences. And I enrolled in a spiritual direction training program run by some mystical Episcopalians, Anglicans, and discovered there a Christianity I had never known, Christian mystic tradition. One of those professors was very strongly influenced by Sufi Islam, the mystical branch of Islam religions. And so it was a wonderful training ground in mystic traditions and contemplative traditions. And for a number of years before then, I had other people telling me I was called to Christian ministry, and that was affirmed by congregations and by denomination, and was in seminary and those kinds of things. So that's a short version of a story that could be much longer. It probably doesn't feel short to you or to your congregation, but it's short.
No, this is really fascinating. And realizing that you were connected to those traditions before you were connected to Christian ministry is interesting. And I think that it's so having you as a professor during COVID-19 and the stress that goes along with that, especially from the perspective of people who are in some type of spiritual leadership, has been amazing, because you embody these things that you're talking about. You embody just kind of that lack of panic and that space of grace. Thank you again for doing this.
Thank you all so much.
Have a good one.
Yep. Take care.